What happens when a racist cop pulls a gun on a black army general? A single moment ignites a chain of events that will change their lives forever. Who will survive the fallout? Who will face justice? This is a story of power, prejudice, and the cost of hatred. The fluorescent lights of the supermarket buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the aisles. Shoppers moved in a slow, methodical rhythm, their carts squeaking against the polished floor. Ryan adjusted the collar of his police uniform, the fabric itching against his neck. He hated shopping in uniform, but his shift had run late, and he needed groceries. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the day's failures. Another reprimand from his sergeant, another missed opportunity for promotion. He felt invisible, like a ghost in his own life. At the end of the aisle, a woman's voice cut through the hum of the store. It was sharp, commanding, and unapologetic. Ryan's head snapped up. There she was, a black woman in an army general's uniform, her posture straight, her eyes focused. She was speaking to a store employee, her tone firm but not unkind. "I understand its policy," she said, "but this coupon is valid. I'd appreciate it if you could honor it." The employee stammered, clearly flustered. Ryan felt his jaw tighten. He didn't know why, but the sight of her, confident, authoritative, in control, made his blood boil. It wasn't just her. It was everything she represented. Success, power, respect. Things he had never achieved, no matter how hard he tried. He remembered Jake, his younger brother, sitting in a jail cell, his face pale and hollow. "They ruined me, Ryan," Jake had said during their last visit. "That black officer, he humiliated me. He made sure I'd never recover." Ryan's fists clenched at the memory. He had promised himself he'd never let someone like that hurt his family again. Without thinking, Ryan stepped forward. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice louder than necessary. The woman, Kate, turned to face him. Her eyes were calm but piercing, as if she could see right through him. "No problem," she said evenly. "Just a misunderstanding." Ryan's pulse quickened. Her composure only made him angrier. "Looks like you're causing a scene," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Maybe you should take your business elsewhere." Kate raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "I'm not causing a scene. I'm simply asking for what's fair." The employee looked between them, unsure of what to do. Ryan took a step closer, his chest puffed out. "You think just because you've got those stars on your shoulder, you can do whatever you want?" Kate's expression hardened. "This has nothing to do with my rank. It's about respecting the rules." "Respect?" Ryan scoffed. "You people don't know the meaning of the word." The air between them crackled with tension. Shoppers nearby had stopped to watch, their whispers growing louder. Kate took a deep breath, clearly trying to de-escalate the situation. "I don't know what your issue is, but I suggest you walk away." Ryan's hand twitched toward his holster. "Or what? You'll arrest me?" Kate's eyes flicked to his hand, then back to his face. "I'm not here to fight you, but if you pull that gun, you'd better be prepared to use it." The challenge in her voice was like a match to gasoline. Ryan's vision blurred with rage. Before he knew what he was doing, he drew his weapon, the barrel trembling as he pointed it at her. Gasps echoed through the store. A child cried out, and someone dropped a glass jar, the sound shattering the silence. Kate didn't flinch. She raised her hands slowly, her gaze never leaving his. "You think you're better than me?" Ryan snarled, his voice shaking. "You think you can just walk in here and—" "Ryan!" a voice shouted. It was the store manager, his face pale as he held up a phone. "I've called 911. Put the gun down." For a moment, Ryan hesitated. His finger hovered over the trigger, his mind a whirlwind of anger and fear. Then, slowly, he lowered the weapon. His chest heaved as he stared at Kate, her expression unreadable. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Shoppers began to back away, some filming the scene on their phones, others whispering in hushed tones. The store manager stepped forward cautiously, his hands raised. "Ryan, please," he said, his voice trembling. "This doesn't have to go any further." Ryan's grip on the gun tightened, then loosened. He holstered it, his hands shaking. His eyes darted around the store, taking in the shocked faces of the onlookers. He felt exposed like a cornered animal. Kate lowered her hands but didn't break eye contact. "You just made a huge mistake," she said quietly, her voice steady. "But it's not too late to fix it." Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The sirens were deafening now, and the flashing lights of police cars reflected through the store windows. He took a step back, his mind racing. What had he done? 2 officers burst through the doors, their weapons drawn. "Hands where we can see them," one shouted. Ryan raised his hands, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced at Kate one last time, her expression a mix of pity and resolve. As the officers approached, he realized his life would never be the same. The store was chaos, shoppers crying, employees huddled together, and the weight of what had just happened settling over everyone like a storm cloud. Ryan was led out in handcuffs, his head bowed, while Kate stood tall, her presence commanding even in the midst of the turmoil. Outside, the flashing lights of the police cars illuminated the parking lot. Reporters were already arriving, their cameras trained on the scene. Ryan's mind raced with thoughts of Jake, his family, and the consequences of his actions. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Kate watched as Ryan was placed in the back of a squad car. She took a deep breath, her mind already shifting to the next steps. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about justice, accountability, and the systemic issues that had led to this moment. As the car drove away, the crowd began to disperse, but the tension lingered in the air. The spark had been lit, and the fire that followed would change everything. The video went viral within hours. Grainy footage of Ryan pointing his gun at Kate in the supermarket aisle flooded social media, accompanied by outraged captions and hashtags. News outlets picked up the story, and by morning it was the lead on every major network. The clip was played on a loop, dissected by pundits, and shared millions of times. The nation was divided. Some saw Ryan as a rogue cop who had finally gone too far, while others defended him, claiming he was being unfairly targeted. Ryan sat in his small, dimly lit apartment, the blinds drawn tight. His phone buzzed incessantly, calls from his sergeant, his union rep, and his family. He ignored them all, staring at the muted TV screen where his face was plastered next to Kate's. The cheering beneath the footage read, "Off-duty cop pulls gun on Black Army general. Racism or self-defense?" He felt numb. The weight of what he'd done pressed down on him like a physical force. He replayed the moment in his mind, the way Kate had looked at him, calm and unyielding, even as he pointed the gun at her. He had wanted to scare her, to make her feel small, but she hadn't flinched. If anything, she had seemed disappointed. A knock at the door startled him. He hesitated, then shuffled over and peered through the peephole. It was Jake, his younger brother, looking more disheveled than usual. Ryan opened the door, and Jake pushed past him without a word. "You've really done it this time," Jake said, his voice tinged with bitterness. He threw himself onto the couch and ran a hand through his unkempt hair. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to Mom and Dad? They're getting death threats, Ryan. Death threats." Ryan sank into a chair across from him, his head in his hands. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he muttered. "You didn't mean to pull a gun on a decorated army general in the middle of a supermarket?" Jake snapped. "What the hell were you thinking?" "I wasn't thinking, okay?" Ryan shot back, his voice rising. She reminded me of him, that officer who ruined your life. I couldn't help it." Jake's expression softened, but only slightly. "You think I don't get it? I hate them too. But this is next level stupid, Ryan. You're going to prison, and there's nothing anyone can do about it." Ryan's stomach churned. He had been suspended pending an investigation, but he knew it was only a matter of time before charges were filed. His career was over. His life was over. Meanwhile, Kate sat in her office at the military base, surrounded by stacks of paperwork and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Her phone buzzed nonstop, calls from reporters, colleagues, and even a few high-ranking officials offering their support. She ignored most of them, focusing instead on the task at hand. Her aide, Lieutenant Daniels, knocked on the door and stepped inside. "Ma'am, the press conference is scheduled for 3 p.m. Are you sure you don't want me to handle it?" Kate shook her head. "No, this is something I need to do myself." Daniels hesitated, then nodded. "Understood. I'll make the arrangements." When he left, Kate leaned back in her chair and let out a long breath. She had been through worse: basic training, combat zones, the relentless scrutiny of being a black woman in a male-dominated field. But this felt different. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been targeted because of their race, their gender, their very existence. She thought about Ryan, the way his hands had trembled as he held the gun. There had been fear in his eyes, but also something else, raw and desperate. She didn't pity him, but she understood, in a way, how he had gotten to that point. Hate wasn't born in a vacuum. It was taught, nurtured, and fed until it consumed everything. The press conference was held in a packed auditorium at the base. Cameras flashed as Kate stepped up to the podium, her uniform immaculate, her posture unwavering. She looked out at the sea of faces: reporters, activists, military personnel, and took a deep breath. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady. "I know there are a lot of questions about what happened yesterday, and I want to address them directly. What occurred in that supermarket was not an isolated incident. It was the result of a system that allows prejudice to fester and grow. It was the result of a culture that too often turns a blind eye to injustice." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But this is not just about me. It's about every person who has ever been made to feel less than because of who they are. It's about every person who has been told, directly or indirectly, that they don't belong. We cannot allow this to continue. We must demand accountability, not just for the actions of one individual, but for the systems that enable those actions." The room erupted in questions, but Kate held up a hand. "I'll take a few questions, but I want to be clear. This is not just about Ryan. This is about all of us. And it's about what we're willing to do to create a better, more just world." As she answered questions, her mind wandered back to Ryan. She didn't know what would happen to him, but she knew this moment would define both of their lives. For better or worse, they were connected now, bound by a single, explosive moment in a supermarket aisle. That night, Ryan sat alone in his apartment, the TV still on but muted. He had watched Kate's press conference, her words echoing in his mind. "This is not just about me." He felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name: guilt, maybe, or regret. His phone buzzed again, and this time he answered. It was his lawyer. "Ryan, we need to talk," the man said, his tone grim. "The DA is pushing for charges. Assault with a deadly weapon, hate crime enhancements, the works. This is serious." Ryan's chest tightened. "What are my options?" "We can fight it," the lawyer said. "Argue that you were provoked, that you felt threatened. But it's going to be an uphill battle, especially with the video." Ryan closed his eyes. "What if I apologized? Took responsibility?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "It's a risky move, but it could help. It might not change the outcome, but it could sway public opinion." Ryan nodded, even though the lawyer couldn't see him. "Set it up. I'll do it." When the call ended, Ryan sat in the silence, the weight of his decision settling over him. He didn't know if it would make a difference, but he knew he had to try. The fallout had only just begun, and the road ahead was long and uncertain. The police station was a hive of activity, the air thick with tension and the faint smell of stale coffee. Ryan sat in a small, windowless interrogation room, his hands clasped tightly on the table in front of him. The fluorescent light above flickered slightly, casting a harsh glow on the pale green walls. Across from him sat Detective Morales, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for being thorough and unyielding. Morales flipped through a folder of documents, her expression neutral. "Let's go over this one more time," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You were off-duty in uniform at the supermarket. What prompted you to approach General Kate Williams?" Ryan shifted in his seat, his throat dry. "I thought she was causing a scene. I was just trying to de-escalate the situation." Morales raised an eyebrow. "By drawing your weapon?" Ryan looked down at his hands. "I didn't mean to. It just happened." Morales leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Ryan, I need you to be honest with me. This isn't just about you anymore. This case has national attention. If there's something you're not telling me, now's the time to say it." Ryan hesitated. He wanted to tell her about Jake, about the years of resentment and anger that had led to that moment. But the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he shook his head. "I've told you everything." Morales studied him for a long moment, then leaned back in her chair. "All right, but you should know we're digging into your background. Your work history, social media, your family. If there's anything there, we'll find it." Ryan's stomach churned. He thought about the posts he'd liked, the comments he'd made, the things he'd said in private that he'd never thought would see the light of day. He felt exposed, like a man standing on thin ice, waiting for it to crack beneath him. Meanwhile, Kate sat in a conference room at the military base, surrounded by her legal team and a group of investigators from the Department of Defense. The room was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of papers or the soft tap of fingers on keyboards. "We've reviewed the footage from the supermarket," one of the investigators said, pushing a laptop toward her. "It's clear that Ryan initiated the confrontation. But we need to know if there's any history between the two of you. Had you ever met before that day?" Kate shook her head. "No. I'd never seen him before in my life." The investigator nodded, making a note. "And you're certain there was no provocation on your part? Nothing that could be misconstrued as a threat?" Kate's jaw tightened. "I was holding a bag of groceries and speaking to a store employee. If that's a threat, then we have bigger problems." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Finally, the lead investigator spoke. "General Williams, we're not questioning your actions. We just need to ensure that every angle is covered. This case is under a microscope, and we need to be prepared for anything." Kate nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling of frustration. She understood the need for thoroughness, but it was exhausting to have her every move scrutinized, her every word dissected. As the investigation unfolded, details began to emerge that painted a troubling picture of Ryan's past. Internal Affairs uncovered multiple complaints against him, allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, and hostile behavior toward colleagues. His social media activity revealed a pattern of liking and sharing posts from extremist groups, as well as derogatory comments about Black leaders and public figures. One particular post stood out: a photo of Jake in his Army uniform, captioned, "My brother was railroaded by a system that favors diversity over merit." The post had been shared widely among white supremacist forums, with comments praising Ryan for standing up to the real enemy. When Morales confronted Ryan with the evidence, he felt the walls closing in. "This isn't who I am," he insisted, though even he wasn't sure he believed it. "Then who are you, Ryan?" Morales asked, her tone sharp. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been nursing a grudge for a long time, and now it's blown up in your face." Ryan didn't have an answer. He thought about Jake, about the promises they'd made to each other as kids, to always have each other's backs, no matter what. But now, sitting in that interrogation room, he felt more alone than ever. Kate's team, meanwhile, was working tirelessly to build their case. They interviewed witnesses, reviewed security footage, and compiled a detailed timeline of events. They also uncovered something unexpected: a connection between Ryan's family and a local white supremacist group. "This changes everything," Kate's lawyer said during a late-night meeting. "If we can prove that Ryan's actions were part of a larger pattern of behavior, it could strengthen our case significantly." Kate nodded, though the revelation left her uneasy. She had always known that racism was systemic, but seeing it laid out so starkly was unsettling. It wasn't just about Ryan. It was about the people who had shaped him, the beliefs they had instilled in him, and the systems that had allowed those beliefs to flourish. The investigation reached a turning point when Jake agreed to speak with investigators. He sat in the same interrogation room where Ryan had been, his hands trembling as he recounted the events that had led to his expulsion from the army. "It wasn't just one thing," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was everything. The way they looked at me, the way they talked to me, like I didn't belong. And then, that officer. He humiliated me in front of everyone. I couldn't take it anymore." Morales leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. "And your brother? How did he react?" Jake hesitated, then sighed. "He was angry, more than angry. He blamed everyone but me. And I let him. It was easier than admitting I'd messed up." The room fell silent as Morales processed his words. "Do you think your brother's actions in the supermarket were influenced by what happened to you?" Jake looked down at his hands, his shoulders slumping. "Yeah, I do." As the investigation continued, the media frenzy only grew. Protesters gathered outside the police station, demanding justice for Kate and accountability for Ryan. Counter-protesters showed up as well, their signs and slogans a stark reminder of the deep divisions that still existed. Ryan watched it all from his apartment, the TV muted but the images searing into his mind. He felt like a man caught in a storm, powerless to stop the chaos swirling around him. One night, as he sat alone in the dark, his phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "We need to talk." Ryan stared at the screen for a long time before finally responding, "Meet me at the park." The two brothers met under the dim glow of a street lamp, the park empty save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "You need to come clean, Ryan, about everything." Ryan shook his head. "I can't. They'll crucify me." "They already are," Jake said, his voice firm. "But if you take responsibility, if you show that you're willing to change, maybe it'll mean something." Ryan looked at his brother, seeing the pain and regret in his eyes. He wondered if Jake was right, if maybe there was a way out of this mess. But as he walked home that night, the weight of his actions pressing down on him, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. The investigation had only just begun, but the cracks were already showing. And Ryan knew that, sooner or later, everything would come crashing down. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with reporters, spectators, and curious onlookers. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made it hard to breathe. Ryan sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He wore a suit that felt too tight, too foreign, like it belonged to someone else. His lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Patrick Harris, shuffled through a stack of papers, his expression focused but grim. Across the room, Kate sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture straight, her face calm but resolute. She wore her army uniform, the stars on her shoulder catching the light. Her legal team flanked her, a group of seasoned attorneys who had handled high-profile cases before. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair and piercing eyes, called the court to order. "This is the case of the state versus Ryan Cooper," she announced, her voice carrying through the room. "Let's begin." The prosecution wasted no time. Their opening statement was sharp and direct, painting Ryan as a man consumed by hatred and prejudice. They played the supermarket footage on a large screen, the grainy video showing Ryan drawing his gun and pointing it at Kate. The room collectively held its breath as the scene unfolded, the tension palpable. "This is not just about one man's actions," the prosecutor said, her voice ringing with conviction. "This is about a system that allows such actions to go unchecked. Ryan Cooper is a product of that system, but he is also a perpetrator, and he must be held accountable." When it was the defense's turn, Patrick Harris stood and approached the jury, his tone measured but persuasive. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to hear is a story of a man who made a mistake. Terrible, regrettable mistake. But it was just that, a mistake. Ryan Cooper is not the monster the prosecution wants you to believe he is. He's a human being, flawed and imperfect, but capable of change." Ryan kept his eyes on the table, his stomach churning. He wanted to believe Patrick's words, but they felt hollow, like a thin veneer over the truth. The prosecution called their first witness, the store manager. He recounted the events of that day in vivid detail, his voice shaking as he described the moment Ryan drew his gun. "I've never been so scared in my life," he said. "I thought someone was going to die." Next came the shoppers who had witnessed the confrontation. Their testimonies were consistent, each one adding another layer to the damning narrative. One woman broke down in tears as she described how her young daughter had been traumatized by the incident. "She still has nightmares," the woman said, her voice trembling. "She thinks the bad man with the gun is going to come back." Ryan felt a pang of guilt so sharp it nearly took his breath away. He wanted to look away, to block out the words, but he forced himself to listen. This was his doing. These were the consequences of his actions. When it was the defense's turn, Patrick called Ryan to the stand. The room fell silent as Ryan stood and walked to the witness box, his legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. He swore to tell the truth, his voice barely above a whisper. Patrick began with soft, leading questions, guiding Ryan through his version of events. "Can you tell us, in your own words, what happened that day?" Ryan took a deep breath. "I was at the store and I saw her, General Williams. She was arguing with the employee, and I thought she was causing trouble. I just wanted to help." "And what happened next?" Patrick prompted. "I approached her, and we started talking. But then, she challenged me. She said if I pulled my gun, I'd better be prepared to use it. I don't know what came over me. I just snapped." Patrick nodded sympathetically. "And do you regret your actions?" Ryan's eyes filled with tears. "Every day. I wish I could take it back. I never meant to hurt anyone." The courtroom was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. For a moment, it seemed like Patrick's strategy might work, that the jury might see Ryan as a flawed but remorseful man. But then the prosecution stood for cross-examination. "Mr. Cooper," the prosecutor began, her tone sharp, "you say you regret your actions, but isn't it true that this wasn't an isolated incident? That you have a history of hostile behavior, particularly toward people of color?" Ryan's heart sank. "I don't know what you mean." The prosecutor pulled up a series of social media posts on the screen, each one more damning than the last. Racist memes, derogatory comments, and even a photo of Ryan at a rally with known white supremacists. "Do you recognize these posts, Mr. Cooper?" the prosecutor asked. Ryan's mouth went dry. "Yes," he whispered. "And do you still maintain that your actions in the supermarket were just a mistake?" Ryan didn't answer. He couldn't. The prosecution's final witness was Kate. She took the stand with the same calm confidence she had shown in the supermarket, her presence commanding the room. "General Williams," the prosecutor began, "can you describe how the incident has affected you?" Kate took a moment before answering. "It's been difficult, not just for me, but for my family, my colleagues, and everyone who looks to me as a role model. But what's harder is knowing that this isn't an isolated incident, that there are countless others who have experienced similar, or worse, and have never gotten justice." The prosecutor nodded. "And what would justice look like for you?" Kate looked directly at Ryan, her gaze steady. "Justice would be accountability, not just for Ryan Cooper, but for the systems that allowed this to happen. Justice would be ensuring that no one else has to go through what I did." Her words hung in the air, a powerful reminder of what was at stake. When the defense rested its case, Patrick called one final witness, Jake. He took the stand reluctantly, his hands trembling as he swore to tell the truth. "Jake," Patrick began, "can you tell us about your relationship with your brother?" Jake glanced at Ryan, his expression conflicted. "We've always been close. He's always looked out for me. And do you believe your brother is capable of change?" Jake hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I do." But on cross-examination, the prosecutor pressed harder. "Jake, isn't it true that your brother's actions were influenced by your own experiences in the Army? By your resentment toward the officer who disciplined you?" Jake's face flushed. "That's not... Isn't it true that you and your brother have both harbored resentment toward people of color in positions of authority?" Jake looked down, his shoulders slumping. "Yeah, he admitted quietly. It's true. The closing arguments were a battle of narratives. The prosecution painted Ryan as a man consumed by hate, a product of a broken system but also a willing participant in it. The defense argued that Ryan was a flawed but redeemable man, someone who had made a terrible mistake but deserved a second chance. When the jury left to deliberate, Ryan felt like he was holding his breath. The minutes stretched into hours, the tension in the courtroom growing with each passing moment. Finally, the jury returned. The foreman stood, a single piece of paper in his hand. We find the defendant, Ryan Cooper, guilty on all charges. The room erupted, gasps, murmurs, a few muffled cheers. Ryan felt the world tilt beneath him, the weight of the verdict pressing down on his chest. As the judge set a date for sentencing, Ryan looked over at Kate. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Ryan understood the true cost of his actions, not just for himself but for everyone involved. The trial was over, but the fallout was just beginning. The prison visiting room was cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over the rows of tables and chairs. Ryan sat at one of them, his hands cuffed and resting on the table in front of him. He wore a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, the fabric rough against his skin. The room was quiet, save for the occasional murmur of conversation and the clink of chains. He had been in prison for 6 months, though it felt like a lifetime. The days blurred together, a monotonous cycle of routines and regulations. He had tried to keep his head down to avoid trouble, but it was hard. The other inmates knew who he was, what he had done. Some respected him for it. Others wanted to make him pay. The door opened, and Ryan looked up, his heart skipping a beat. It was Jake. His brother looked older, his face lined with worry and fatigue. He sat down across from Ryan, his eyes searching his face. "Hi," Jake said, his voice soft. "Hey," Ryan replied, his throat tight. The two stared at each other for a while. The silence between them was heavy, filled with all the things they hadn't said, all the things they couldn't take back. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "How are you holding up?" Ryan shrugged. "As well as I can, I guess. It's hard." Jake nodded, his expression grim. "I can't imagine." Ryan looked down at his hands, the cuffs digging into his wrists. "I've had a lot of time to think. About everything. What I did, what I said, what I believed." Jake leaned forward, his eyes intent. "And," Ryan took a deep breath, "and I was wrong. About everything. I let my anger, my hate, it consumed me. And now look where I am." Jake's face softened, and Ryan saw a glimmer of the brother he had once known. "It's not too late, Ryan. You can still make things right." Ryan shook his head. "How?" "I'm in here for the next 5 years. My life is over." "Your life isn't over," Jake said firmly. "It's just different now. But you can still change. You can still be better." Ryan looked at his brother, seeing the hope in his eyes. It was fragile, but it was there, and it encouraged him to feel the same way, with a thread of optimism and hope. Meanwhile, Kate sat in her office at the military base, the soft hum of the air conditioner filling the room. She had just finished a meeting with her legal team, going over the final details of the foundation she was starting. It was called the Line of Fire Initiative, a nonprofit dedicated to combating systemic racism and supporting victims of racial injustice. The foundation had already gained significant traction, with donations pouring in from across the country. Kate had been inundated with requests for interviews, speaking engagements, and partnerships. It was overwhelming but also empowering. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was making a real difference. Her aide, Lieutenant Daniels, knocked on the door and stepped inside. "Ma'am, you have a visitor." Kate looked up, surprised. "Who is it?" "It's Jake Cooper, Ryan's brother." Kate's eyebrows rose. She hadn't spoken to Jake since the trial, though she had followed his story in the news. He had been working to rebuild his life, distancing himself from his family's toxic beliefs and trying to make amends for his past. "Send him in," Kate said, her curiosity piqued. Jake entered the room, his posture stiff and his expression nervous. He looked around the office, taking in the awards and photos on the walls, before his eyes settled on Kate. "General Williams," he said, his voice respectful. "Thank you for seeing me." Kate nodded, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Have a seat, Jake." He sat down, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I don't know where to start." "How about the beginning?" Kate suggested, her tone gentle but firm. Jake took a deep breath. "I'm here because I want to apologize. For everything. For what I did, what I said, what I believed. I was wrong. And I'm sorry." Kate studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Apologies are a start," she said finally. "But they're not enough. What are you going to do to make things right?" Jake looked down, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know. But I want to help. However I can." Kate leaned back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful. "Then help me. Help us. The Line of Fire initiative is just getting started. But we have a long way to go. We need people who are willing to do the hard work, to confront the systems that enable racism and injustice. Are you willing to do that?" Jake looked up, his eyes filled with determination. "Yes, whatever it takes." Kate nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Then welcome aboard." Jake had also recently spent a lot of time reflecting on his attitude toward superiors, how he had reacted to events during his time in the military, and how his family had influenced that. The months passed, and the world began to change. The Line of Fire initiative gained momentum, its programs and initiatives making a tangible impact in communities across the country. Kate became a leading voice in the fight against systemic racism, her story inspiring countless others to stand up and speak out. Ryan, meanwhile, began to find purpose in prison. He joined a rehabilitation program, attending workshops and counseling sessions that challenged his beliefs and forced him to confront his past. It wasn't easy. There were days when he wanted to give up, to retreat back into the safety of his anger and resentment. But he kept going, driven by the hope that he could still make things right. One day, he received a letter from Kate. It was short and to the point, but it carried a weight that left him breathless. "Ryan, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I felt like I needed to write it. What you did was wrong, and the consequences were severe. But I believe in redemption. I believe in second chances. If you're willing to do the work, to confront your past and make amends, then there's still hope for you. The road ahead won't be easy, but nothing worth doing ever is. I hope you find the strength to take that first step. Kate." Ryan read the letter over and over, his hands trembling. He felt a sense of clarity, of purpose. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He was ready to change. Ryan stood in the prison yard, the sun warm on his face. He looked up at the sky, his heart filled with a sense of hope and determination. In the distance, he heard the faint sound of laughter. A group of inmates playing basketball, their voices carried on the wind. Ryan felt good, like he belonged there. He took a deep breath, the weight of his past still heavy but no longer crushing. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, yet he was ready to walk it. This story makes us reflect on the cost of hate and the power of redemption, reinforcing that there is always time to change deep-rooted thoughts and prejudices. Thank you for being with us. If you enjoyed it, give it a like, share, and subscribe to embrace the journey for more powerful stories.